Danielle Colby spent years watching from the sidelines as everyone else argued about what really happened between Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe. She kept the shop running, answered uncomfortable questions with careful smiles, and let the rumors pile up around her like the antiques stacked floor to ceiling in every corner of antique archaeology. For a long time, she had nothing to say, or at least nothing she was ready to say out loud. That changed. What she eventually put on record about Frank's departure from American Pickers, about his health, his pain, and a friendship that slowly dissolved under the weight of a television machine neither of them fully prepared for, landed in a completely different place than fans had expected for years. No screaming feud, no backstabbing. Just a story about a man whose body gave out, a friendship that quietly survived long after the camera stopped rolling, and a woman who watched all of it from close enough to know exactly how it ended. Back in 2010, when the History Channel took a genuine risk on two guys from Iowa digging through barns and garages for forgotten objects, Danielle wasn't the one climbing into attics. She was the anchor. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz drove the white van across the country, hitting small towns and rural properties, while she stayed back in LeClaire, Iowa, running antique archaeology, tracking leads, and keeping everything operational behind the scenes. When 3.1 million people tuned in for that first episode, nobody had predicted it, and neither had she. The shop transformed overnight into a destination that fans drove hours to visit. Danielle went from answering phones and logging inventory to being a recognizable face with her own following, people drawn in by her tattoos, her burlesque background, and the fact that she never seemed to be performing for anyone. What the audience picked up on immediately was that she was real, and in the world of reality television, real is rare enough to be magnetic. Mike and Frank worked as a pair in a way that felt genuinely unrehearsed, and Danielle understood that dynamic better than most people did. Mike was always the one carrying the larger vision, talking about preserving history, chasing the next discovery, building something that went beyond a weekly television program. Frank moved at a different pace, dug into the smaller details, and cared more about understanding how an old toy or machine actually worked than whether the scene was playing well on camera. That difference is what made them click. Danielle fit naturally in the middle of it, talking shop with Mike about future plans and checking on Frank whenever he sounded tired on the phone. It operated like a small family built out of a shared obsession with old junk, and for a long stretch of those early years, it mostly was. Fame rewrites the terms of almost every relationship, and by 2015, the show was spending $250,000 more per episode than it had in the beginning, which meant the stakes had grown just as fast as the audience. Mike leaned into the recognition, opened a shop in Nashville that drew crowds, and built a public identity around the picker lifestyle. Frank wanted nothing to do with that version of success. He stayed in Illinois, kept his world small, and Danielle would tease him about being the quiet star while he'd grunt and redirect the conversation. What she started noticing, though, was that the friction between them had shifted from the easy banter she'd always found entertaining into something heavier and harder to laugh off. Mike needed every find to deliver for television. Frank just wanted to pick things that genuinely interested him. Those goals aren't incompatible until a full production crew and a network's financial expectations are wedged between them every single day, and by that point they always were. By 2017, Frank's Crohn's disease was no longer something he could manage by pushing harder. His calls to Danielle grew shorter and less frequent. When he did call, something flat had settled into his voice that hadn't been there before. Crew members started passing along information she wasn't getting directly from Frank, that he was missing days on set, that he was visibly struggling, that something was clearly beyond what a schedule adjustment could fix. She didn't press him when she asked how he was doing, and he said he was just tired. That was Frank. He didn't open up easily, and she had always respected that about him. But the distance between what she was hearing from the crew and what he was telling her kept widening, and the production schedule was built for people in good health, grinding through close to 250 days a year on the road. Frank wasn't that anymore, and everyone around him could see it except, it seemed, the machine itself. March 2020 was when it ended. Frank's last episode aired, and he was simply gone from the show after that. Mike called Danielle and said Frank wasn't coming back, and the explanation didn't arrive with much detail attached to it. She didn't push for more. She could hear in his voice that he was carrying something heavy, and she let him carry it. Frank eventually gave his version to the press, saying he hadn't spoken to Mike in 2 years and that Mike hadn't reached out during the period when his back was deteriorating badly. Danielle heard all of that and didn't fully accept the framing because she had watched Mike rearrange shoots when Frank was sick and make real accommodations that never made it into any article. But she also understood, in a way that didn't require taking sides, why Frank felt like the supporting cast in someone else's story. American Pickers had always been Mike's vision first. Frank had been running alongside it, and when his legs finally gave out, the machine didn't slow down. That's not a villain story, but it's not a simple one either. Behind that fallout, Frank's situation was far worse than the public understood from the outside. 17 hospital stays in 2 years from the Crohn's disease alone, followed by a rehabilitation program in 2020 for alcohol. Danielle heard about it through people connected to the production. She didn't think less of him for it. Chronic pain pushes people into decisions they wouldn't otherwise make, and Frank had been managing serious physical pain for years without much visible support from the structure around him. She held on to an image of him hauling a rusty bike into the shop once, completely lit up about the find, talking about it like he'd uncovered something the rest of the world had forgotten mattered. That version of Frank stayed with her through all of it. He was still in there somewhere, but he was losing the fight to stay that version of himself. Fans online were persistent and loud. They wanted a conflict with clear edges. They wanted someone to blame. Danielle stayed off the subject for over a year, posting antique shop content, keeping her Instagram presence light and focused on the objects rather than the drama, and dodging every pointed comment that tried to assign her a position. In July 2021, she decided she was done allowing tabloids to construct a story out of her silence. She posted a photo with Mike, wrote that she was out on the road again with her best friend and big brother, and made her position clear. Then she kept going. She wrote that she was genuinely saddened by Frank's absence, that she had watched his struggles from close range for a decade, and that Frank had caused so much pain for himself that it had been hard to witness. She wrote that she hoped he would receive all the help he needed to become well after years of being unwell. That line hit differently than a feud statement would have, because it carried no anger and no score settling. What it carried was grief, and grief for a specific kind of slow loss that fans hadn't been given the vocabulary to understand until that moment. She explained why she was speaking at all. Tabloids had been lifting fragments of her silence and assembling stories out of them, and she was done with that process. The only reason she was addressing any of it, she wrote, was because her words were being taken out of context by publications that couldn't reach her directly, and she wanted people to hear exactly how she felt from her. She picked Mike because he had always shown up for her, but the care she still had for Frank came through in every line she wrote about his struggles, and that tension was something she let sit rather than resolve neatly. The stroke that hit Frank in 2022 was serious enough to reshape everything that came after. Mike went to the hospital and remained close throughout the recovery, bringing photographs and objects from their years of picking together. Danielle tracked it from a distance through people they both knew. What she heard consistently was that Mike was present in a way that never got publicized, paying for things Frank couldn't cover, sitting with him during the hard stretches, not building a narrative around any of it. When Frank passed away in October 2024, Mike called her and his voice was completely wrecked. He told her he had been there through the final days. Danielle didn't post immediately. She sat with it for a day, thinking about what it meant to lose someone she'd known since before any of this was a television show. The full interview she eventually gave was calm, unhurried, and short, which was the right call. She laid the facts out without manufacturing emotion on top of them. Frank's health had been in serious decline since 2018, with those 17 hospital stays in 2 years making it physically impossible to sustain the demands of road-based television production. Mike had made real adjustments, moved shoots, waited, and tried to work around the limitations. But the gap between what Frank could offer and what the show required had grown past the point where adjustments could bridge it. Frank didn't leave because the relationship broke down, she said. His body made the choice before either of them could. The feud narrative that fans had spent years building, the jealousy theories, the money conflicts, the idea that success had poisoned a lifelong friendship, all of it collapsed under that single, unglamorous explanation. She addressed Mike's presence in Frank's final years without sentimentality or performance. He had shown up, covered costs, and kept showing up after the professional chapter was long closed. Mike didn't make noise about any of it, she said, and that was entirely consistent with how he operated. But the showing up was the answer to every abandonment accusation that had been circulating online for years. She remembered both of them the way she'd always seen them clearly, Frank as the quiet one who found the small treasures that made people feel something, and Mike as the dreamer who believed that pulling history out of forgotten places was worth building a life around. American Pickers was constructed from both of those things simultaneously, and it still carries Frank's fingerprints in every episode whether his name appears in the credits or not. She was proud of what they had built together. She said it plainly and without decoration. Then she walked away from the camera and left it exactly there.